Welcome to Transformational Leadership, the podcast for leaders building high-performance organizations and teams. In every episode, you will hear from executives and transformation experts who've led with vision, executed under pressure, and delivered real, scalable, and impactful results. You'll hear practical insights and leadership stories from executives who've driven change, delivering transformation, and consistently winning in highly complex environments. No fluff, just frameworks, lessons, and stories from the front lines of leadership. If you're serious about building competitive impact through people, you're in the right place. Here is your host, Jeff Harnois.
Hello, and welcome to the Transformational Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Harnois. My next guest is Eric Rodriguez. He's the Deputy Chief Human Resources Officer at Dallas College, one of the largest junior colleges in the United States located in Dallas, Texas. They have over 127,000 students, 6,000 employees across 7 campuses, and I'm excited to learn more about that. In my conversation with Eric today, we're going to talk about compensation and trust. We're going to talk about leadership and HR transformation, and we're ultimately going to talk about technology and AI transforming how work happens. So with that, everyone, please join me in welcoming Eric to the stage. Eric, it's really nice to see you.
Same here, Jeff. Thank you for having me. I'm really glad to be part of the conversation today.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks so much for joining. Really interesting perspectives. I don't think that we've had a lot of guests coming from academia. And so I'm really interested to get your perspectives on these topics that we're going to be talking about. In our previous conversation, you talked a little bit about the relationship between compensation and trust. And, trust is one of the things that's always on my mind when I'm working with executive teams or teams in general. It's such an important topic to me because it is always the foundation of every good relationship. So I'd love to hear your perspective on, compensation and trust. Let's go there.
Yeah, I think my insight or one insight that has stayed with me throughout my career is that employees really don't experience compensation the way most organizations intend to design them. We often design compensation systems, obviously on spreadsheets or through certain frameworks, but the employee experience is very different, and they experience them as sort of more on the edge of stability versus instability based on what they're going through on their day to day. So when you're looking at compensation as a whole, which is part pay and benefits, it's really about how simple we are designing and how transparent they are, these programs, so that people feel the sense of predictability. They can develop that trust factor because the programs are so easy for them to understand and relate to that they're easily able to read through them, understand them, move forward, perform based on what they're understanding and what they're looking to get out of them. But many organizations, what we run into is that we tend to overly complicate these programs. And we design them with this overall intent, trying to build so much, compliance and structure, and almost to a certain degree, there's a safety net approach to these programs. And for the most part, many folks are just missing out on, hey, these programs could be very useful. They can be implemented really well, but let's try to simplify the programs so that most employees can really understand them. And then most of all, you as a compensation or an HR professional can truly understand how effective these programs are once they've been implemented.
That's a really, really interesting perspective. And I'll tell you what was coming up for me while you were talking. This is a little bit upstream, but there's a management philosophy: inspect what you expect, which is, you're checking on the things that you expect. And the act of inspection sort of sends a signal to the people downstream that this is important to you. The second part of that, though, is incent what you expect. And that's where the compensation program comes into play. And I cannot tell you the number of organizations that I work with that are incenting the wrong behaviors and the wrong outcomes, and then they can't figure out why they're not getting what they want on the backside.
That is so true. And many times you see that basically compensation professionals start running around and saying, "Oh, we need to survey our population," or are we even focusing on the right target group within the organization? And I think for the most part, this is where the trust factor comes in. Compensation or compensation professionals, they're so stuck in the framework and the overall elements of the design and the components that they miss the human element to these programs. And I think that's what really creates a lot of confusion as they're designing these programs, but it also impacts the overall effectiveness of many of these programs.
That is such an interesting perspective because we see, if, forgive the de-evolution here a little bit. We see a lot of compensation experts as very analytical and quantified, quant type folks, and they're trying to make the math work. And maybe they're tapping into Radford or other sources that help them sort of come up with the right answer. And there seems to be a disconnect between what's happening at the compensation design step and then what happens out in the field. And so if you can bridge that gap and help the compensation folks understand what experience are you creating through this outside of the numbers, and do they add up, and are they in the right ranges, and so on and so forth, all the work that comp folks do, really understanding how that affects downstream behaviors, I think is often a missing step in the compensation world.
It's true, and the other part is we miss out on being flexible in our approach. And what I mean by that, when you mentioned Radford and you look at, how quickly is the market moving or how slow is it? Snapshot of market data is only that. It's a snapshot, right? It's giving you an idea of a point in time. But as a compensation professional, you really need to understand how flexible and agile you are in understanding where the market is and where it's going. And how do you want to advise leadership around, hey, are we falling too behind in how we're paying and rewarding our employees, or are we going too far ahead? And then obviously you've got the whole budgetary aspect to it. So there's a lot that comes into it, and I think that for many compensation professionals, like you said, they're so analytical and so stuck in the spreadsheets that we miss the mark in that aspect. And that's something that I kind of fell into early on in my career. And it's something that obviously you see through a lot of compensation professionals as they're continuing to grow and progress in their careers.
Hmm. I think about compensation a lot from the perspective of sales compensation, because that's my background. Not compensation, but sales as a practice. And just to sort of bring the conversation full circle, we don't inspire trust in our salespeople if the compensation plan is one too complicated. We don't achieve trust with them if the compensation plan is unattainable. It's, again, just somebody put math in a spreadsheet and came out with an answer, and it has no relevancy of what's happening in the field. We actually create distrust or mistrust in the organization, and I think that goes a long way, specifically down to performance. We're not incenting the performance we want because our incentives are missing or misaligned, but then ultimately we sort of create unnecessary attrition as well.
That's correct. Yeah. And it's funny you mentioned that because I mean, I started my career in sales and I did that for probably the first, I don't know, 11, 12 years of my career, and then stumbled into an opportunity where I was trying to move out of the direct outdoor sales role into something that maybe was more of a farmer type approach to sales, and stumbled into a role in a sales compensation role. And that for me was, first of all, didn't understand the compensation aspect of it. I said, well, this is an internal role. I'll probably be able to stay indoors, not travel as much. But it really opened my eyes to what the capabilities of HR are, meaning you are at the center of an organization where you get to see all the ins and outs, how things are connected, what's the business strategy, what are some of the leadership decisions, what's the real day-to-day experience for many of our employees. And that really kind of catapulted me into a career within HR. Obviously, with my experience, I've had an opportunity in many organizations to not only work in compensation or total rewards, but how we're impacting performance and culture and leadership. These aren't just typical HR related programs, but they're actual systems that really shape how people experience the work that they do on a day-to-day basis, and how the organizations really build trust with their employees and their workforce.
Yeah, this is really fascinating. If we take this back into the world of transformation, and I think of it as, where are you today? That's your current state. Where do you want to be? That's your desired state. In transformation is what happens in between those two things. So when I think about compensation as an enabler or maybe even an impeder of successful transformation, I'm really interested how you think about that from that perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think the transformational component to this, to me, I look at it from, you know, what's our value add or our impact on the organization, and as we continue to transform, not only as individuals but as leaders or as even as a function, what are some of the requirements that we're recognizing in the relationships that we're forming with our employees and the work that they're fundamentally shifting away from, right? If you think about some of the things that we went through with COVID, the after effects of COVID, where in many cases, many folks were not accustomed to working in a remote environment. Um, Me coming from sales, I was pretty much accustomed to that. I've also had the opportunity to have a remote or a hybrid role prior to COVID, but I think it fundamentally changed and it triggered something in many to really understand a different way of working. And also, how are we creating the why behind the work? And many times you're hearing, and I think there's a great book by Stephen Covey on trust and inspire, and he talks about the differences between the old way of leading or managing, which is more that dictator type approach where this is what you must do based on what I said, and now you really creating that trust and really inspiring your folks to explain the why behind the work. And that to me talks a lot about some of the changes and what's really transformed over the past couple of years. Um, and it also talks about not only from a leadership perspective, from also how technology has influenced the way that we work. So transformation to me is just such a broad scope of so many things that we're experiencing. But I think for decades, many organizations have assumed that people would anchor to these large organizations and they build their identities around the career that they've built at a specific organization, the title they've held. And once that's torn away or it's been removed, they find that they really don't have a sense of purpose anymore. Um, and today's employees, what you're seeing is that they are truly valuing their time, where they spend their energy. Obviously, their well-being is extremely important, and that's one of the most probably the most valuable resources or focuses that they have. And so, from a leadership perspective, I think it's important for us to really understand that shift in how we're designing the workplace, um, how we're respecting that level of autonomy, flexibility, and obviously building that sense of purpose while still delivering strong performance and building high performers within our organization.
Gosh, you had a gold mine in that that section right there. Yeah, the Stephen Covey analogy. Do you remember the name of the book?
Trust and inspire.
That's the name of the book. Okay, Trust and Inspire. So people can look that up and order it. One of the elements that, or one of the things that was rattling around in my head as you were talking is, in some ways, what you've given is the definition in my mind between management and leadership. Management has a real sort of task orientation to it, but leadership is really about inspiring people and processes and technology and organizations to be able to see the future in some ways. I call that vision casting. Be able to see what's possible and then, have the intention to then be motivated to go pursue that. And so leadership for me is a little bit of a bigger, broader brush. And certainly it's not that there's not a place for management. There is, right? Helping organizations and teams all sing from the same song sheet is a really, really important component. But when it comes to transformation, I think identifying what's possible, the front end of transformation, identifying it, creating it, there's some real magic that happens there.
Yeah, and I think one of the challenges today, especially with leadership, is they're not understanding the current gap that is there and exists today, right? So if you look at just as far as what's the challenge that we're seeing today? Well, there's a growing perception of the gap that does exist between leaders and their employees. The leadership is so focused on the metrics. How productive are we? Are we hitting our numbers? Obviously, even from my own perspective, the operational efficiency, right? What are the outcomes on how we're performing? Which these are all very important things, right? But the employee is focusing more on what does this mean to me? I really am enjoying the autonomy that I have or I had. How does this really balance with what my interests are outside of the workplace? And these are perspectives that, for many, they're just not aligning. And the trust factor of all of this really begins to erode. First of all, leaders are in many cases they talk about building the trust, but I don't think they truly understand the approach to it. And I think when you look at transformational leadership, it requires how we're looking at closing that gap, which means you do have to be much more intentional around how you're listening or how you're approaching your employees. How are you showing up in different meetings? And also designing a system that truly is reflecting the realities of what those employees are experiencing on a day to day.
Fascinating. When you think about transformation in this context, and maybe back to compensation and trust, and we'll wrap up this segment here, but what are the main principles that you might want to employ, in your current role or in any role if you were in charge of compensation? And what are the key principles that you would want non-compensation based leaders to know?
For me, it's more of the simplicity.
Okay, great.
Let's make sure that we're building a clear and concise form of communication. And let's remove all of the uh, either HR or legal jargon from how we speak. And what I mean, and part of that is because again, just looking at my own experience, like I mentioned, starting with sales compensation, and there was such focus around how the verbiage that we're using in the language in some of these programs, they had to meet certain legal standards, and in many cases, there were actual agreements that folks were signing and the sales force was signing. The approach that we had towards our sales folks, it was more of we need to protect ourselves and our interests before we take a look at the employee and how they benefit. And to me, it was more of I had a completely different way of looking at it. For me, it was well, wait a minute, sales is like the lifeblood of your organization. Without them, you and I are not employed. And I think for many, they lose sight of that. Whether you're in a sales related organization or if it's an IT related organization, there are certain fundamentals that you really need to hone in on and focus on. And a big part of that is understanding what is the main driver of your organization and how are you simplifying and making sure that the communication flow of a lot of these programs is much more easier for those individuals that don't speak this language every day.
That seems like really, really not only practical and applicable, but realistic advice. Yeah, I love that perspective. Let's pivot over to leadership and HR transformation. Really interested what you're thinking about there.
Well, like I mentioned, I mean, I think the challenges around the leadership transformation is that they really not are not understanding employees or even their organization's perspective on a lot of the programs that they are looking to implement. Um, I know from my perspective today, we're looking at where we're going to be in the next 4 or 5 years, right? And the focus has always been more related to what are some of the main gaps that we have today? How are we identifying those gaps? And then how are we actually targeting to make sure that we're establishing true metrics and goals that are going to help us achieve that? There is a huge change management component to that. And there's a cultural shift that also applies to a lot of these initiatives. And for many organizations, I think they miss the mark on that. They just think it's just another goal and another number that we need to hit. There's a lot more that goes into that, and it's more around how intentional are you in approaching the changes that it does require in order for you to be able to make such transformational changes within your organization. A big part of that is for them to understand, wait a minute, how is this going to change the way that I approach my work on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah. This is Derek, this is such a deep vein. I tell people this all the time. It doesn't matter how good or right or excellent your change strategy is. It also it doesn't matter. I mean, it does, but it, it may not matter that you've got, excellence in execution. If you don't understand the shifting, let's call them sensitivities or pressure points from a cultural standpoint, from a institutional history standpoint, on the people that are going to be the recipients of the change, and to the people who are going to be making the change. If you don't understand the signals that they're sending and then address them, even the best change strategy will fail.
That's true. That's really true.
Yeah, good. Well, that's good insight. Do you have any examples or stories to share of maybe one that went well?
Let me go to the early lessons that I learned about leadership, which which to me was one of the things that really urged me in really thinking about, oh, wait a minute, I can really lead not only in some of the ideas that I had, or but what does it really mean to lead, right? Um, and I remember as a kid, I was actually organizing a small car wash business. Couple of friends. I had my brother involved, and we were going door to door just trying to ask neighbors to say, "Hey, would you allow me to wash your car just for about $5?" It was a very simple approach, but it taught me something important about taking initiative, making sure that you have an ability to influence not only your own team, but others that you're trying to obtain business from. The importance around collaboration and teamwork. Later, as I went on to move into an actual job, I started working at a grocery store, and some of that started to kind of come up again, and it reemphasized just my approach to, I wouldn't say sales, but it's just my overall philosophy, which is really more around in the grocery store. Every time I took out a cart full of groceries and was really engaging with that customer, loading the car with groceries. Back then, they used to tip you. Um, and they would every time I would load, a car with groceries, I was always getting tips. And I would, kinda look at other friends as they were trying to walk back into the grocery store and ask them, "Hey, did you get any tips? Did you get this?" And I would make comparisons. And what I started to learn was it taught me that there is something about how you interact with people. How do you engage in conversation? And your attitude really has a lot to do with that. It's not so much about the title, it's not so much about the level in your organization. It's really about which is really tied to the authority aspect of it, right? But there's a real a value add about creating an experience for the people that you are looking to serve. And I think when you really start looking at things from that perspective, many of us in the leadership role today, we're serving either our direct reports, our organization, our leadership, and it's really about number one, the attitude, and number two, for me, it's what are some of the things that they're looking for that I need to find solutions for, or I need to find some sort of way in order for us to make some of these things reality. Um, because I've never thought of myself as a great salesperson. I always thought of myself as I'm not good at sales, but I have a pretty good sense of what I can find based on conversations I have with my customers to understand what they're actually looking for, and my job is to get it for them.
You said something that resonates with me a lot. And you were framing it as what sort of experience do you give others? And I think the experience component is absolutely on track. But the other thing that comes up for me, and again, this goes back to our previous conversation about you can have the best change strategy that in the world, but if the people aren't on board, if you haven't addressed them in their on their frequency, kind of a thing, there's a pretty good chance that you won't be successful. And it comes down to this: people don't always remember what you say, but they always remember how you made them feel.
That's correct.
And so when you talk about creating experiences and then ultimately being able to monetize it, which a lot of organizations are really good at, that relationship makes a ton of sense to me. That seems like a home run. And listen, what a great story from, your early developmental years. The other thing that came up for me while you were talking, I was kind of, smiling a little bit. When my boys were, preteens, we did the same thing. We grabbed a lawnmower and we walked around the neighborhood, and it's like, here you go. I'm going to provide you with the equipment and the gasoline. You now can make some money off of it, but you got to have the courage to go knock on the door, and you got to set a price, and then you got to do the job. And I think with both of them, it gave them this sense of empowerment. For one thing, I'm capable of doing this and I can do this for myself. But the other was just like, I'm out and I'm getting exposure in the world where I'm not necessarily comfortable, and something good is happening.
And I think the one thing that I took away from that experience that's really helped me is you start developing a business mindset, and you approach your work with that business mindset in the sense of when I'm thinking through, and I've seen this even with other peers and colleagues as we've had discussions, in many cases, they're approaching things as the employer will provide. And for me, it's more of, well, no, how do we provide it so the employee understands that they're enabled to do it? Meaning, we need to find a way in order for us to be able to financially support or enable some of these activities, or programs. And I think that opportunity, understanding what it took to actually put together a business, work through it, the sacrifice that's put into some of these. Because I mean, I've had other ventures, and even as a kid, after that car wash, and I was working at the grocery store, I said, "This grocery store thing is not for me." Uh, and started a side hustle, selling T-shirts and printing T-shirts and doing just a bunch of things that, enabled me to have this entrepreneurial approach. Um, but for me, it was I've always pursued my work as I'm not necessarily a true business owner in the sense, but I lead a function and there is financial responsibility to that. And so how do I approach this with an entrepreneur mindset?
Love that. That's actually one of my leadership principles is it doesn't matter what function you lead. You should think and act like you're the CEO. Yeah, think about it strategically, think about the money you're spending and the ROI for whatever investments you're recommending or making. Think about the performance of your team and the quality of your product like a CEO would. And, that's been pretty transformative in itself for a lot of folks that we've worked with. Yeah, good story, really good story. Thank you for sharing that. Let's pivot over to technology and AI. Obviously, it's the buzz of the world. We're kind of in a weird place right now where everyone's excited about AI and everyone is equally afraid of AI. And I can't say that I blame them. I think that it has a lot of potential, but we haven't quite seen it be as invasive, I think, as a lot of people expected it to be. You're thinking about AI from the perspective of how to transform work. Tell me more about that.
Well, I think the technology and AI as a whole, number one, it's created a lot of insecurity, and people are really anxious about, wait a minute, what do you mean about AI? And especially when they start talking about the possibility of losing your job over AI, right? And for me, it's not so much of a scare tactic as it is a wake up call for many to understand if you're not willing to educate yourself on what exactly is AI, what are some of the possibilities that it may have, and what's the impact that it will have on your job today. For me, we've been having conversations with our HR function about embracing AI and how do we really look at it improving the work that we're doing. I agree that in many cases the work will change, um, but we have to trust what ultimately will determine whether those transformations actually succeed. Meaning, there are so many things in which you can think about. Let's just say, look at we were talking about the compensation professional. It's going to completely transform how these spreadsheets are being developed, created, formulas. A lot of these things. You've got folks that have invested ton of time and finances in investing in their certifications and careers, and AI is coming around, and you can basically create a very interesting prompt. It'll pull together a spreadsheet with the formulas already embedded in there, and it's amazing what it does in a couple seconds, just depending on how quickly you actually create the right prompt. And so for me, the real opportunity is designing systems where that technology enhances the human element or the judgment rather than replacing it. And how do we coincide together, human based with the technology, and making it work and to improve your day to day. And for many employees, they're seeing the technology helping them to do their work better. In many cases, they become partners of innovation. They're not feeling that they're actually being replaced by it, but it's more of an enhancement to the way that they approach the work. Um, and it's also, believe it or not, what I'm seeing in many cases, it's making people really think very differently in how are they approaching the work. Um, Meaning they're being a lot more strategic about how they're approaching the workload or how the AI or the technology will help them facilitate a lot of the anxiety that may come out of the unexpected, right? Many cases, I think we put things together and we're kind of have an understanding of what leadership may ask for or anticipate certain questions or concerns. But you can actually using AI and that technology, if you understand exactly how it works, you can actually prompt it to grade it. Does it really address concerns, the typical leaders and how they would ask follow-up questions to these? And, so I think there's just so much that we have to learn from um, and implement using the technology and especially around AI.
I have a little bit of context here for this particular transformation, and I don't it's not my intention to give my age away, but I probably will with the story. I remember when the calculator was sort of becoming a real conversation point in education. There were a lot of folks who felt like something would be lost if we replaced, writing formulas out and doing the work and showing your work for that matter. And I was never a really quantitative based person, so being able to use a calculator, not only helped me do the lower level stuff that I was doing, but it opened up all the upper level stuff that I wasn't capable of doing on my own. And that because of that, it sort of raised my game and what I was capable of as an operator in a business. And so same kind of thing with spreadsheets, right? I can do things with spreadsheets that if I had to sit down and maybe figure it out on my own earlier, that would have been much more difficult. So I hope that AI becomes that same kind of enabler that allows people to reach new levels. Now, I know that's a little bit of a naive view and maybe a naive hope, but that is what I hope happens, that people embrace AI from the perspective of I can do more. One other quick example. I think I'm a decent writer. Um, and I do the work and I write, and then I ask AI to go ahead and edit it for me, and it always comes back better. And then what happens is I start thinking about what I created a little bit differently and even at a higher level. So, yeah, I don't have any trepidation around that from my own perspective, but I know organizations are. In the academic world, I think there are probably a variety of use cases with AI from, the classroom experience and the homework experience. But what about from an administrative standpoint as the CHRO? How are you thinking about AI?
Well, we're embracing it. I mean, for us, again, there's the huge human element of it. We're really trying to educate our employees around the usage of AI and how do we use it. We are talking about AI governance, and we've already established sort of a governance committee. What are some of the things that you can add into a ChatGPT or a Copilot, which we don't use ChatGPT, but um, and what are some of the things that you shouldn't, right? What are some of the concerns you need to have, around privacy and things of that nature? So for us, it's been really a huge educational, um, approach to AI, And then obviously reinforcing the message around let's not be afraid. Let's make sure we're educating ourselves. And we're currently in the process of building training programs around how to use it. Every year we go through Professional Development Day, which is basically 2 days, one at the institutional level, one day that's focused at the institutional level. We've got speakers that come in, and we have individuals that will volunteer to have specific presentations that they want to speak on particular topics. And then the following day is you go with your own function and you develop what that professional development day is going to look like. And a big part of that this year was also things around AI and how are we approaching it? What are some of the things that we see as a value add? Our current CHRO was part of a cohort, and he's actually implemented went through a capstone, and so we were asking all of our senior leaders and our employees in HR to come up with one very simple solution that AI could help improve your day or your work. And it was just so interesting to see all of the presentations that we got that as the team started to think through, they themselves were pretty surprised at the amount of time that they were saving on doing some of this work. But then we started asking questions around, okay, so how does that time then equate to a cost of labor, right? And I think that's where the real efficiencies come, and you're also enabling this complete different mindset to approaching AI from not only it's helping me do work, but there is a cost savings that comes along with that. And so I think as an organization, when you really look at it, your ROI, you're gonna get that. You just need to invest on the education, and that mind shift, with your employees.
I really like the idea. I don't know if, at least in the initial phases, if capstone is the right idea, but something like that. I really like this idea of, you sit through the theoretical and conceptual lecture stuff, and then the next day you go, do something with it, workshop it, or, application it, or, think about how you could make it serve you. I really like that relationship. I'll bet you get a lot of advancement really quickly from there.
Oh, absolutely. I think for the most part, we've seen so much engagement from it, that it's been incredible. Now, the big question obviously is when we've got so many things going on, how do I take a step back and really start implementing some of these things that I'm learning? And I think that's been the real challenge.
That's good stuff. Well, Eric, I have to tell you, I've really enjoyed the conversation. Really, really good insights in interesting content. I want to pivot to a question that I ask all of my guests, and it's, what was the best piece of advice you received and didn't take?
Um, I think the best piece of advice that I probably didn't take early on was around remaining curious. Um, my dad's had a huge influence on me, entrepreneur, very focused on kind of creating his own path. And just to see how he's led himself, how he's led his businesses, his partnerships, his relationships. The one thing he would always tell me is remain curious. And at the beginning, I didn't take it because I didn't understand what that meant. Um, as I've gotten older, I have obviously understood much more what he meant, and a big part of that is you don't need to be the loudest guy in the room. That's number 1. Number 2 is make sure that you do come across and you really are a good listener. Listen, listen, listen. The employees, your direct reports, your family, your friends, your relationships, and partnerships that you create, everyone is there to tell you something. The more you listen, the more you will intake, the more that you will better understand, and the more that you'll be able to approach things in a much more effective and productive way.
I like that. I really like that. Yeah, be curious. One of my personal themes as well. Yeah. I'm having a little moment right now because I'm thinking about a variety of executive level clients that we work with, and, they're so driven to be right and first and, all of that. It's like, maybe just replace that even occasionally with curiosity. Curiosity about learning something new, curiosity about what other people think and how they're approaching things. And I mean, curiosity is one of the reasons I do this podcast, to sort of hear and learn from others and hear, I'm curious about their experiences. So, yeah, I'm a big fan of that. That's really good advice from your dad.
Thank you.
Yeah. You said you didn't take it at first, but it sounds like you are now.
Absolutely.
Yeah, good. Good for you.
Yeah, and many times, we'll sit in some of these meetings. I'll kick off the meetings, and immediately I will sit back, and it's my opportunity really to listen through different perspectives. And it really gives you so much insight into different personalities, where people are in their career. There's a lot that you take in when you have an opportunity to really just sit back and listen, and try to understand as people are interacting, speaking. A lot of that is also being very analytical and observant. But the more you listen, I've seen it's just you just gain so much more than you probably would have expected.
Yeah, love that. Well, in that same vein, because you've been around the block a little bit, and you have a very interesting background, especially in some of the disciplines around HR, and then, having a little sales experience, I don't think hurts anybody. But what advice would you give to somebody new to HR as a field that, might stack the deck in their favor towards success?
Well, obviously, I would have to say about the curiosity, right? But I think more importantly, which is something that's really helped me, is I've always been willing to be the first to raise my hand. And it talks to the assertiveness and being also open to different opportunities, right? Um, I could not have gotten to where I am today if it wouldn't be for my willingness to understand and listen to some of the concerns or opportunities that were out there. And just to give you an example, we had an opportunity where one of the organizations I was working for had acquired a smaller company. And that smaller organization didn't really have an HR presence. They had someone that was in payroll that was kind of doing both things, but didn't really have an HR presence. And I was in compensation. I was looking for different things to learn, different approaches, different ways of doing the work I was doing. And there was a comment that was made saying, "Oh, they don't have an HR presence, so we're going to have to ask one of our HR business partners to see if they'll be willing to go to." It was in a different state, and visit with them, and they'll probably have to stay with them probably for about 60, 90 days. And, I immediately went to them and said, "Hey, if there's an opportunity, I would love to. I'm open to relocating. I'm opening to moving. I'm opening. I'll do it." And immediately the person was kind of taken back, and I could see that there was sort of a no, that's not going to work. But at the same time, there was also a sense of shock, right? Wait a minute, you're coming to me. You haven't even been asked. This is not even your area. And yet you're looking to do something very different. And the one thing that I've appreciated from that person was the willingness to listen, but more importantly, to ask questions. That person could have easily have told me, "No, it's not in your area. You don't have that background or experience. We're not doing it." But instead, they said, "Well, tell me, why are you so interested in doing that? Is there something going on at home? What's the reason for you to relocate? You know that that's a possibility of relocation. Once you move into that role, you won't be able to do what you're currently doing today." And there were just a lot of questions that they were asking. And I guess because of the fact that I was so open to it, um, they basically gave me the opportunity. And from there, I went on to compensation, did HR business partner work. I did some work in talent acquisition. I did some employee relations work, and then eventually came right back to compensation and total rewards. But it was a tremendous experience, and it really gave me so much insight from an HR perspective, and just for as a professional.
There's a couple of things that I appreciate about that story. One in particular is it seems like the fear factor with the emerging generation coming into the workforce, that the fear factor is a paralytic. Um, it's really holding, I think, young, highly talented and capable individuals from being more what I would describe your story as being more opportunistic and being open to, new things. I think that is an excellent piece of advice to sort of configure yourself in a way where you have that openness and that flexibility and an eagerness to explore, I would maybe add.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think with what we're seeing today, I think there's so much predictability from a social aspect that because again, if you think about fear, fear is basically generated because you don't know. It's the unknown.
The fear of the unknown, exactly right.
And so today what you're seeing is that everything is so predictable. To a certain degree. You can, ask AI, for certain things, and it'll tell you just about everything. And people are making decisions based on what they think is going to be the predictable next step. Um, and so I think, to your point, we may be aging ourselves to a certain degree, but obviously there's just so many things, and obviously it's just a new approach and a new way of doing based on the technology and the things that we have available to us today, which is quite different than what we're used to.
Yeah, yeah. Really good stuff, Eric. The final question for me is, y you've been around the block a few times. That means that you've collected some wisdom along the way. What piece of wisdom would you share with somebody in your peer group, a fellow HR executive or even, business level executive? What would you wanna what would you want them to know?
I think if you go back to what we started with on transformation, right? I think the way we approach our way of work, our leadership style, um, my thing would be make sure that you're being transformative in the sense we talk about people that are constantly reinventing themselves. We are in such a rapid and evolving society today with new technologies, expectations that are constantly changing around the flexibility, definition of what career success looks like or does not look like. We really need to be open to transforming how we look at things, our perspectives, and how we approach the way we show up as leaders and as professionals. That to me would be the one big thing that I would really share with my peers and colleagues.
Okay, that's excellent. That's really excellent. Eric, I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, and I hope you did too. I'm grateful that you came on today and we were able to have this conversation.
Well, it was great. I appreciate you for having me on and appreciated the conversation. It was fantastic.
If folks wanted to reach out to you and get in touch with you, what's the best way to reach you?
They can reach me on LinkedIn.
Okay. Well, we'll run a banner here with your LinkedIn information. People can copy that down for the viewers. For others, you can find Eric on LinkedIn. Eric-Rodriguez is a good place to start, and then go from there. Eric, thanks again. Looking forward to seeing you again and wishing you continued success.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Take care.
The Transformational Leadership Podcast requires more than a conversation. It takes vision, action, diagnostics, and collective wisdom. If today's episode resonated with you, be sure to let us know in the comments. We'd love you to join the conversation and help us transform the future together. We'll be back with more stories, strategies, and real-world solutions that are transforming organizations, leaders, and teams. In the meantime, be sure to like, subscribe, write a review, and share it with someone you think would benefit from it too. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.